AITA for refusing to pay almost half of my boyfriend's mortgage, even though he earns twice as much. Am I being unfair or just protecting myself? Broken heart money with wings. Here's the thing about love after divorce. You don't go into it the same way you did in your 20s. You're not as naive. You're not as quick to believe in fairy tales. You carry scars, whether you want to or not. And when I met him, I told myself I was ready to try again, ready to believe that maybe love could be different this time. We were both in our 40s, both coming out of divorces that had left us a little bruised but not broken. He was handsome in that steady, older man way, confident, self-assured, the kind of person who always seemed to know what he wanted. And I was drawn to that. After years of instability, his calmness felt like an anchor. Our relationship started in the simplest of ways. Coffee dates that turned into dinners, long walks where we shared stories of our pasts, evenings where we laughed about the mistakes we made in our marriages. There was an ease with him that I hadn't felt in years. He didn't rush me, didn't pressure me. He made me feel like I could breathe again. I remember one night in particular. We were sitting on his couch, sharing a bottle of wine, and he looked at me and said, "You know, I never thought I'd feel this again. Not after everything." I felt the same. It was like we had both been wandering through storms and finally found a safe harbor in each other. A year and 4 months later, we were planning to move in together. It felt like the natural next step. We spent so much time at each other's places anyway that packing up and making one home seemed almost inevitable. I was excited, nervous, but excited. I thought this was the beginning of something lasting, something stable. At the time, I had no idea that moving in together would become the very thing that exposed cracks I didn't want to see. That what seemed like a practical conversation about finances and fairness would turn into nights of crying, arguments about loyalty, and a question I still don't know how to answer. Was I wrong for saying no? The first few months with him felt like I was finally living the kind of life I had always dreamed about. After years of being in a marriage where I felt invisible, suddenly I was with someone who noticed me. He noticed when I changed my hair. He noticed when I was tired and told me to sit down while he cooked dinner. He noticed when I was stressed and offered to run errands so I could relax. It was intoxicating. This idea that maybe, just maybe, I had finally found someone who valued me. For me, he had a beautiful house, not a mansion, but big enough to feel impressive. 2 stories, a backyard, a spacious kitchen with granite countertops. When he invited me over, I couldn't help but compare it to my own smaller, rented apartment. I told myself it didn't matter, that we were equals, but a small part of me couldn't shake the feeling that he held a kind of financial power I would never have. Still, I brushed it off. We were building a relationship, not a bank account, and he never made me feel lesser. At least, not at first. I remember how easy it was to fall into routines with him. Sunday mornings meant coffee on the porch. Friday nights were for takeout and movies. During the week, he'd call me at lunch just to check in. He made space for me in his world in ways that felt genuine. My kids from my previous marriage were grown, and for the first time in decades, I felt like I could focus on myself again. With him, I felt young, like I wasn't defined by my past mistakes, by my debts, or by the failures of my marriage. But even in the middle of this harmony, there were small cracks. He liked to joke about how he had learned his lesson from his divorce, how his ex had taken a chunk of his assets because she never lifted a finger while he worked. The bitterness in his voice was hard to ignore. He told me more than once that he would never make the same mistake again, that he'd protect what was his no matter what. At the time, I thought it was just talk, a man venting about his past. But looking back, I see those comments for what they really were, warnings. There were other little things too, like how he'd flinch slightly whenever I offered to pay for dinner, or how he seemed uncomfortable whenever money came up in conversation. He wasn't stingy exactly. He paid his share. He never asked me for anything. But there was a tension there, a wall I couldn't quite see over. I told myself it was nothing, that all couples had quirks, that what we had was solid, stronger than money or bitterness from the past. For a while, I believed that. I believed we were building something real, but illusions don't last forever. And soon, I would find out just how fragile ours really was. When you've been dating for over a year, talk about the future comes naturally. It wasn't one big sit-down conversation, more like little threads that started weaving themselves into our daily lives. At first, it was simple things. Him saying, When you move in, this will be your side of the closet. Or me joking. Guess I'll have to learn how to use that fancy coffee machine of yours. We were comfortable enough with each other that the idea of sharing a home didn't feel rushed. It felt inevitable. But moving in together isn't just about love. It's about logistics, bills, groceries, who cooks, who cleans, and yes, money. And that's where things started to shift. Point one evening over dinner, I brought it up gently. So, when I move in, how do you want to handle expenses? Should we split things? Do you want me to contribute to utilities or groceries? I expected a practical, maybe even lighthearted conversation. Instead, his whole demeanor changed. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, his voice calm but firm. I think the fair thing is for you to pay almost half of my mortgage, plus half of all the bills. For a moment, I thought I had misheard him. Almost half of his mortgage? On a house he bought long before I came into the picture? A house that was in his name, tied to his credit, his investment, his future? I blinked, unsure how to respond. But you make almost twice what I do, I said carefully. And the mortgage is yours. It's not like we're buying a place together. He didn't flinch. Fair is fair, he replied. If you're going to live here, it's only right that you contribute the way a partner should. Why should I carry all the weight just because I bought this house before we met? His words stung, not because I didn't want to contribute, but because of how transactional it all sounded. We weren't talking about building a life together. We were talking about percentages, rent, and obligations that I reminded him that I had. Debts from my divorce, that paying nearly half of his mortgage would eat into my ability to pay them off and regain stability. I reminded him that he was financially secure, that he had savings, assets, a cushion I could only dream of, but he brushed it off. Your debt is your problem, he said, and my mortgage is the reality of living here. If you want the comfort of this home, then you should contribute accordingly. I sat there in silence, staring at my plate. I thought about how, in my last marriage, money had been used as a weapon, how every expense, every dollar, had been a reminder of how powerless I was. I thought I had escaped that. And here I was again, listening to a man I loved explain why my worth in his home depended on how much I could pay. After that night, I couldn't stop noticing the way he talked about money. He would mention how much his divorce had cost him, how unfair it was that his ex-wife had walked away with a chunk of his assets when she never worked a day in her life. He repeated the story often, always with bitterness in his tone. And each time, I felt a chill in my chest, because it wasn't just a story. It was a warning that I started to realize that when he talked about fairness, what he really meant was control. That to him, love and partnership weren't about building something together. They were about making sure he never felt taken advantage of again. And suddenly, the future I had been so excited about didn't look so simple anymore. The word fairness became his favorite shield. Whenever money came up, he repeated it like a mantra. I just want things to be fair. At first, it sounded reasonable. Who doesn't want fairness in a relationship? But the more I listened, the more I realized that his definition of fairness and mine weren't the same at all. For him, fair meant splitting things down the middle, no matter the circumstances. Bills, groceries, utilities, even his mortgage. It didn't matter that he made twice what I did. It didn't matter that his house was bought and paid for before I even met him. To him, equality meant numbers on a page lining up evenly, not considering who had what burdens, who carried debt, who had fewer resources. I tried to explain my perspective. I told him that partnership wasn't just about splitting costs like roommates. It was about balance, about supporting each other in ways that made sense. If you make more, you can carry more. If I make less, I contribute in other ways. Cooking, chores, emotional support. That's what partnership is. But he didn't see it that way. His jaw would tighten, his voice sharp. That's what my ex did. She played the I contribute in other ways card, and look where that got me. Broke. Burned. Never again. He said it so often that I began to feel like I wasn't even me in his eyes. I was just another version of the woman who had hurt him before. Every time he looked at me, I wondered if he was really seeing me, or just seeing her shadow. It wasn't just about money, either. His fairness seeped into other parts of our relationship. He wanted to keep all finances separate, not just while dating, but even if we married someday. He told me he would insist on a prenup. It's not personal, he said. It's just smart. You can't trust anyone these days. I laughed it off at first, saying I understood, that it made sense after what he'd been through. But late at night, lying in his bed, the words echoed in my head. You can't trust anyone these days. Did that include me? Was he building a life with me while secretly preparing for it to fail? The deeper we went into these conversations, the more transactional everything felt. He spoke about our relationship like it was a contract, a deal to be negotiated. He even used words like terms and agreements. Once, half joking but half serious, he said, "We should probably get this in writing, so there's no confusion later." I tried to tell myself it was just his way of protecting himself, that his divorce had left him scarred, bitter, and careful. But deep down, I started to feel uneasy. Love wasn't supposed to feel like a business deal. Love wasn't supposed to come with clauses and conditions. Meanwhile, I was still carrying $30,000 in debt from my own divorce, debt I was slowly chipping away at. He knew about it. He knew how much stress it caused me. And yet, when I asked him to consider a more flexible arrangement, something that would let me keep paying down my debt while contributing fairly to our life together, he brushed it aside. "That's your debt, not mine. Don't make your problems mine." Those words cut me deeper than I expected. Because isn't that what a relationship is? Sharing burdens? Lifting each other up? His refusal to see my struggles as part of our shared life made me wonder if I was really his partner or just a tenant he wanted in his house. And then there was the topic of relationships themselves. I'm monogamous, fiercely so. Loyalty, to me, is non-negotiable. But he had a different view. He admitted that all his past relationships had been open, that he believed monogamy was unnatural. He said he hoped I'd change my mind eventually. And when I told him firmly that I wouldn't, he shrugged and said, "Well, if I did see someone else, I just wouldn't tell you." I felt sick. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about trust, respect, and the foundation of what we were building. He wanted me to pay nearly half of his mortgage while he talked about how fairness was everything. But fairness to him didn't seem to include loyalty or emotional safety. The man I thought was my partner was starting to look more like a landlord with benefits. And no matter how much I loved him, I couldn't ignore the growing knot in my stomach that told me something was very, very wrong. The more we talked about money, the more it stopped being about dollars and cents and started being about ghosts. My ghosts. His ghosts. Both of us dragging the weight of our past marriages into something that was supposed to be new. I'll admit it, I carry scars from my first marriage. My ex-husband wasn't just careless with money, he was manipulative with it. Every purchase I made was scrutinized, every bill used against me. He'd remind me constantly that I depended on him financially, that without him I wouldn't survive. Money wasn't just money in that house. It was power, and he wielded it like a weapon. When I finally left, I didn't just walk away from a marriage. I walked away with debt, tens of thousands of dollars in legal fees, shared credit cards, financial fallout that followed me like a shadow. Even now, years later, I'm still paying for mistakes I didn't entirely make. When my boyfriend asked me to pay nearly half of his mortgage, it wasn't just about the math. It was about what it represented. To him, it might have sounded like fairness. To me, it sounded like stepping right back into the cage I had fought so hard to escape. But he had his scars too. His ex-wife had taken him for a lot of money in their divorce. He never missed a chance to remind me of it. According to him, she never worked a day in her life, but still walked away with a hefty settlement. He paid out, he lost assets, and he swore to himself he'd never let it happen again. I could see the bitterness in him, sharp and fresh even after years. When he talked about her, his whole face changed, the tight jaw, the clipped words, the anger simmering just beneath the surface. He saw himself as a man who had been tricked, used, and punished for trusting the wrong woman. And now, whether he admitted it or not, he saw me through that lens. He never said it outright, but I could feel it. The way he brought up prenups so casually, like it was already decided. The way he repeated, "I won't be burned twice." The way he emphasized that his house, his money, his future would always stay his, no matter who stood beside him. It wasn't fair. I'm not her. I fought my own battles, paid my own debts, carried my own burdens. I wasn't looking for a free ride. I was looking for a partner. Someone to build with, not someone to rent from. But our pasts were poisoning us. My fear of being controlled, his fear of being used. My need for security, his need for control. Every conversation about money became less about the present and more about those ghosts whispering in our ears that I started to wonder if we were doomed from the start. If maybe neither of us was ready for love again. Not really. Because how can you build a future when you're both still living in the ruins of the past? And yet, despite all of this, I still loved him. That's what made it so confusing. I loved the way he laughed at his own bad jokes, the way he reached for my hand in the car, the way he looked at me like I was the only one in the room. Love was there. But love alone wasn't enough to silence the doubts that grew louder with every conversation. The question that kept me up at night was simple, but terrifying. Was I seeing him for who he really was? Or was I just projecting my ex-husband onto him? And was he seeing me for who I really was? Or just another version of the woman who had hurt him? Maybe we were both guilty. Maybe we were both stuck in the past. But what I knew for certain was this. If we couldn't let go of those ghosts, they were going to destroy us. If our relationship was a house, then money was the crack running through the foundation. At first, it was hairline thin, barely noticeable. But the longer we stayed together, the more it spread, deepening and widening until I couldn't ignore it anymore. The breaking point started with what he called just a simple agreement. He wanted us to write down the terms of me moving in, how much I'd pay, when I'd pay, what I'd be responsible for. He framed it like a practical step, like two adults being organized. But the way he slid that notebook across the table, with bullet points already written out, made me feel less like his partner and more like a tenant negotiating a lease that I remember staring at the paper. He had written, mortgage, 45%, me, /55%, him, utilities, 50/50 groceries, 50/50 house maintenance, 50/50. It was neat, calculated, and completely devoid of emotion. No mention of love. No mention of balance. Just numbers and percentages. I looked up at him, my throat tight. Do you even hear yourself? This isn't a partnership. This is an invoice. He didn't flinch. This is called being responsible. I won't make the mistakes I made before. This is fair. I tried to argue. I told him how much debt I was still paying off, how splitting everything like this would suffocate me financially. I told him I wanted to contribute, but that it had to be in proportion to what we earned. That equality isn't always about 50/50. Sometimes it's about equity, about balancing based on what each person has to give, but he just shook his head. That's exactly what my ex said. And look where it got me. The conversation spiraled from there. My voice rose, his grew sharper. I cried, not the quiet tears of frustration, but full, gut-wrenching sobs. I told him I was terrified of repeating my past, terrified of losing myself again in someone else's idea of control, that he didn't comfort me. He didn't reach across the table or pull me into his arms. He just sat there, jaw tight, waiting for me to calm down like I was some irrational child throwing a tantrum. That night, I lay awake in his bed while he slept soundly beside me, and I felt more alone than I had in years. I stared at the ceiling, wondering how I had ended up here again, with a man who said he loved me, but who treated our relationship like a transaction. The next morning, he acted like nothing had happened. Made coffee, read the news, kissed me on the cheek. And that scared me even more. Because if something that broke me down to tears didn't even register as a problem for him, what did that say about our future? The crack in our foundation wasn't just about money anymore. It was about empathy, or the lack of it. It was about whether we even wanted the same kind of relationship. Because I didn't want to be someone's tenant. I wanted to be someone's partner. And the more I looked at him, the more I wondered if he was even capable of that. By the time the argument over the agreement happened, something inside me had already shifted. But I kept trying, because that's who I am. I didn't want to believe that the man I loved was more interested in contracts than commitment. I wanted to believe that if we just talked it through enough, if I showed him my heart, he'd finally understand. But instead, things only got worse. The conversations about money became constant, like an unwelcome soundtrack to our lives. It didn't matter what we were doing, cooking dinner, watching TV, even lying in bed at night. Somehow, it always circled back to the same refrain. It's only fair if you pay your share. One evening, we were having dinner, pasta. I had cooked from scratch, a bottle of wine I'd splurged on because I wanted to do something nice. And out of nowhere, he said, "We really need to finalize our agreement before you move in. I don't want any confusion later." I froze, fork halfway to my mouth. "Can we just enjoy this meal?" I asked, my voice small. But he pushed. He always pushed. The sooner we sign something, the sooner we can move forward. Why is that such a problem for you? Unless you're planning on taking advantage of me. Those words landed like a slap. Taking advantage of him? Me, the woman who had cooked, cleaned, supported him, stood by him even through his bitterness and baggage? Me, who had never once asked him for a dime, who paid for my own things, who carried debt on my back every single day. I set my fork down and just stared at him. My hands were trembling. Do you even hear yourself? I whispered. You're talking to me like I'm your enemy. Like I'm just waiting for the chance to screw you over. He didn't deny it. He just shrugged, like he was being pragmatic. I've seen what happens when men don't protect themselves. I won't be burned again. I excused myself from the table and cried in the bathroom, muffling my sobs with a towel so he wouldn't. Here. Because what do you even say to that? How do you convince someone to see you as a partner when they've already decided you're a threat? After that, the tension became unbearable. We fought more often than we laughed. Every conversation turned into a debate. Every smile felt forced. I started dreading our time together because I knew eventually the subject of money would come up, and we'd be right back in the cycle of defensiveness and accusations that I noticed myself pulling away in small ways. Staying later at my own place, instead of heading to his. Finding excuses to spend time with friends instead of him. Answering his texts with shorter replies. And deep down, I knew it wasn't just about the mortgage or the bills anymore. It was about the fact that I didn't feel safe with him. Not emotionally, not financially, not even as an equal human being. The breaking point came one night when I told him, through tears, that I couldn't do it. That living with him, under his terms, would break me. I told him I needed love, not ledgers. Partnership, not contracts. A future built on trust, not percentages. He stared at me for a long moment before saying coldly, then maybe you're not ready for a real relationship. And in that moment, I realized something devastating. In his mind, love was a contract. And if I couldn't sign my name on the dotted line, then maybe I didn't belong in his version of the future. The night of our last argument, I remember walking into the kitchen after locking myself in the bathroom to cry. My eyes were red and swollen, my hands still shaking, but I forced myself to face him. He was sitting at the table, scrolling on his phone, acting like nothing had happened. The contract he wanted me to sign still lay between us, the pen neatly placed on top like an invitation. Or maybe a threat that I sat down across from him, staring at that piece of paper, and in my mind, I saw two versions of my future. In one version, I picked up the pen. I signed my name. I moved into his house, contributed almost half of a mortgage that wasn't mine, balanced bills with a man who made twice my income, and pretended that was love. I could see it. Nights of quiet resentment, arguments that never ended, me biting my tongue every time I wanted to scream. Why don't you see me as your partner? That version of my future was full of bitterness and exhaustion, of me shrinking smaller and smaller to fit into the space he allowed me. In the other version, I walked away. I left behind the man who made me laugh, the man who held my hand, the man who, in so many ways, had made me believe in love again. But I also left behind the bitterness, the contracts, the cold insistence that fairness meant numbers on a page instead of kindness in a relationship. That version of my future was painful, lonely at first, but free. And for the first time in a long time, I realized that freedom mattered more than love that came with conditions. That I took a deep breath and told him, my voice steady this time. I can't do this. Not like this. I can't live in a house where I feel like a tenant. I can't build a life with someone who prepares for betrayal before giving me trust. I can't love someone who sees me as a liability instead of a partner. He stared at me, stunned. For once, he didn't have a quick answer. His jaw clenched, his eyes narrowed, and then he said quietly, "You'll regret this. You'll never find anyone who gives you what I do." Maybe he was right. Maybe I'd never find someone who checked every box the way he seemed to in the beginning. But I knew I would regret something else even more. Losing myself again. I packed my things that night. Not all of them. Just enough to get me through until I could figure out the rest. He didn't stop me. He didn't run after me. He just sat there at the table, staring at that damn contract, as if the paper mattered more than the woman walking out the door. In the weeks that followed, I went through every stage of grief. Anger, sadness, regret, relief. Some days, I missed him so much it hurt. Other days, I felt lighter than I had in years. I cried when I thought about the moments we shared, the laughter, the tenderness, the way I had believed, even for a little while, that I had found the one. But slowly, the clarity settled in. I realized that what I had mistaken for stability was actually control. What I had thought was love was tangled up in his fear of being used. And what I had convinced myself was fairness was really just another way of saying, I'll never let anyone close enough to hurt me again. I don't blame him for being scarred by his past. We all carry scars. I had mine too. But love isn't about punishing the next person for the wounds someone else gave you. Love is about building something new together, despite those wounds. And he couldn't, or wouldn't, do that. So I made my choice. I chose myself. I chose not to sign away my dignity for the sake of a relationship that already felt like a negotiation instead of a partnership. I chose not to repeat the mistakes of my past by letting money become a weapon in my life again. Was it easy? No. Do I sometimes wonder if I was too harsh, if maybe I should have compromised more? Yes. But every time I look at that mental image of myself sitting at his table, signing my name on that paper, I know I did the right thing. Because in the end, I would rather be single and in debt than partnered and diminished. So here I am, sharing this story with strangers on the internet. Because I can't seem to let it go. I keep asking myself, was I unfair? Should I have agreed to his terms, knowing how much he'd been burned before? Was I selfish for refusing to contribute nearly half of his mortgage, even though I could technically afford it? Even though it would have left me with barely anything for myself? Or was I simply protecting my future, refusing to let history repeat itself? So, Reddit. AITA? Thank you for watching this story on True Tales Hub. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss our next story. That we post new tales twice a day, and each one comes with unexpected twists you won't see coming.